Welcome back to more SOVL PvP. Soul PvP? I'm going to keep saying SOVL. Today we're on the test server checking out SOVL's latest faction, the Darkborn Elves. Now, at the time of recording this, the Darkborn Elves aren't officially out yet, so this video comes with a heavy caveat that everything is subject to change. But I thought it would still be worth jumping in, seeing what this army is about, looking at some individual unit options, and I've even put together a few 500-point lists for PvP. So I think the first thing you might notice, though, is these are still elves. You're still going to get swift on all the units. There's going to be high discipline across the board. You're going to have, high base stats that comes at a cost of higher points cost. So a lot of those things are going to be quite familiar if you played with Conclave or Deepwood. Another thing you'll notice as we go through the individual units is a lot of the unit choices are quite similar to units that exist in those factions and even others such as Goatman. So you can almost think of this as not quite an entirely new thing, but a reconfiguration. It almost feels to me a bit like Elven Union or like the Old World Alliance in Blood Bowl, if that reference means anything to you. Maybe don't think of it as something completely new, but rather a reconfiguration of familiar elements with a handful of completely new stuff as well. But that all comes together to create new options for list building. But with all that said, let's get into the unit, starting with the commanders and the Darkborn Noble. Now, stats-wise, this guy is the same as the Conclave, Elven Noble, and the Deepwood Noble. However, you are giving up Elven Mastery in the case of the Conclave one, and Elven Accuracy, plus the option to take a bow, plus Hunter's Call for the Deepwood one, for instead this new ability called Exploit Weakness, which is an interesting one. It says Commander and Retinue gets +1 attack if attacking flank or rear, activate once per battle. So the fact that this applies to the Retinue as well means it can be really strong. You can almost think of it as a free curse standard, which is normally 40 points. However, there is a condition, and that is that you need to be in the flank or the rear. And that does mean that this ability is not going to turn an unfavorable matchup into a good one, because you're already going to be in the flank or the rear, and your commander's unit is typically pretty punchy anyway. You're typically going to be winning that. However, it does have the potential to turn a good combat matchup into an excellent one, and once popped, I would expect almost anything to die to this. Talking of retinues, though, it is interesting that aside from, well, the Black Dragon is here because we're unrestricted, but in 500 points there are no flying mount options for the Darkborn Noble, and I wonder if that's because a flying mount does make it quite a bit easier to get those flank or rear charges, although I still don't think this would be too strong. Be interesting to see how this sort of plays out. On the one hand, the Darkborn Riders or the Raptor Knights, the sort of mounted units, feel like good options to take because their mobility is going to help you to get those flank and rear charges. On the other hand, though, a big unit of infantry is going to make more of the +1 attack because it'll be +1 per model. So yeah, interesting unit there to see how that plays out. Moving on though to the Darkborn Priestess, again stat-wise it's identical to the other elf mages. It can have a mount at 500 points in the Dark Pegasus, however doesn't have access to Fireball, does have access to Shadow Bolt, but I think that's quite a bit worse than Fireball, and that means you're not going to see the sort of mobile artillery piece that you sometimes see from Conclave with the mage on a mount, which can zip around and blow things up and then still has some combat effectiveness when it can dive in. But the big thing here is that this elf faction finally has access to Hex of Ruin, which, despite some points increases, for me is still the best spell in the game. And it's the best spell because I think it can turn unfavorable matchups into favorable ones. It kind of can break that rock, paper, scissors dynamic. And also with an army with a good amount of shooting, which this one does, it also gives you the option to just pop it on the shooting phase and just blow up, delete something that is a high priority target. So I think that's going to be pretty big for this army. And for that reason, you could also pair the priestess with some crossbows or even some witches, which we'll come onto and look at. But a very punchy unit. So you could have very melee focused retinue there if you wanted to do something a bit spicy. Moving on to battle line though, Darkborn spears, not much to say about them. They are identical to the spears in Conclave and also the Deepwood Guard. Pretty much being them because they're the cheapest battle line option at only 80 points. The Dread Guard, these are sort of elite infantry. They have the option of halberds or great weapons, with great weapons power 4, skill 5, defense 5. So with fearless and the heavy armor, given that increased defense, quite a strong sort of defensive unit. Note on the difference between great weapons and halberds with this power 4. With great weapons, halberds are mathematically only going to be better against targets with defense 6 or greater on the turn that this unit charged, and against targets with defense 5 or greater otherwise. So I think in most cases you're going to want great weapons. Sometimes I do like halberds anyway, just for the ability to deal with things like giants that maybe your army lacks the ability to deal with otherwise. But I think here, great weapon is going to be almost always the way you want to go. These look on paper a little similar to Weapon Masters from Conclave for a similar sort of role. However, they are 1 point cheaper, slightly cheaper. They don't have the Elven Mastery, making them reroll hits, but they do have Fearless, which together with Discipline 9 is nice for just being a bit of a tar pit. But as a kind of somewhat expensive infantry unit that still have only 1 wound, defense 4, maybe a bit susceptible to getting picked off. The nice thing about Weapon Masters is that if they do survive and get into combat, they can really dish it out. Whereas with these guys, yes, Fearless and Discipline 9 is going to mean that they might stick around, help you hold objectives, but it's a pretty high cost to pay for someone to fill that role. So I'm not sure about the Dread Guard. The Darkborn Witches, though, are a super punchy unit, real glass cannon. They are very similar to the Dancers in Deepwood with 2-hand weapons, Swift Frenzy, but instead of Scout, they have poisoned attacks, and I think this is the first instance of poison attacks in PvP, but it means your enemies re-roll 6s on damage saves. So yeah, really punchy unit together if you can combine it with Hex of Ruin. It will just push so much damage through. However, has the only defense 3 and 1 wound each, so an issue that a lot of these infantry units have, which is very glass cannony. They're quite expensive, so you're not going to be able to field a lot of them, or at the very least a lot of other units to kind of protect the flanks. So it might be hard to get that kind of front on combat with this unit. So really cool one, quite kind of spicy, but also very fragile. Moving on to the range support options, and all 3 of these are going to feel very familiar. The crossbows are statistically identical to the Conclave archers, which are the same as the Deepwood ones, but the Deepwood ones have Scout, I believe, which is, just because it's their thing. These are going to be a bit different, though, I think, in this environment, thanks to that inclusion of Hex of Ruin, being able to just shoot and delete something, but yeah, archers are still fairly good. High skill and power means that even if they do get charged, they can still hold their own in melee. Pretty good option here, I think. The Darkborn Shadows, though, similar to Watchers in terms of stats. And actually, I believe they're identical. However, they're slightly worse because Watchers have normal bows at range 30, and these light crossbows have only range 24. Very minor difference otherwise. Two-hand weapon, Swift, Scout, Ambusher. Really nice overall unit. Can dish it out both in range combat and in melee. However, I think similar to why you don't see too many Watchers being played, just a bit too expensive at 13 points per model for an individual model with 3 defense and 1 wound. And I don't think there's anything about this army that's really going to change any of that. So I also don't think we're going to see too many of those. Probably will see a good few bolt throwers knocking around though, because again, functionally identical to the Conclave one and still pretty good. Really nice to have a lethal shots option in the army. There was once a time where in Conclave you could take 2 of these, but just as it is in Conclave now, these are capped to 1 per army at 500 points, despite it being a 0.5 unit option, which was a change that happened a while ago. I think you could probably get away with 2 now in an army like this and it not be too oppressive. I'm not sure. Would have liked also to have seen maybe some variation here. Maybe the sort of crossbow units could all have shorter range but poison attacks on the crossbow bolts. I'm not sure. But moving on to the fast attack, starting with the Raptor Knights. These are going to fulfill, as you'd expect, a similar role to things like Imperial Knights, Lancers. They're slightly better, I think, though. So compared to Lancers, I think they're 1 point more if you take the Lance and Shield option. Lancers have have this option only by default. 1 point more per model, but you get +1 power, which I think is really nice. It really helps them continue to push through damage after that initial charge turn. Often with like Lancers and other units with Lances, like Imperial Knights as well, in fact, being only power 3 means that if the thing you're charging into can survive that initial blow, your damage output goes way down, whereas these won't have quite as big of a drop there, which is really nice. And it's nice also if you just want them to be a bit cheaper that you can switch it out for hand weapon and shield. So yeah, cool unit there. Darkborn Riders, also another cool one. These are the same as the Deepwood Riders if you take the option of adding a shield to the Deepwood Riders unit. However, they're a whole 2 point per model cheaper. And again, they're similar to Reavers with mounted unit with a ranged option. However, with hand weapon and shield, as opposed to just the hand weapon, their defense goes from 3 to 4, which I think is big for a unit like this. It's nice having the ranged option to do a sort of like skirmishy game, but then you also want your kind of somewhat expensive mounted unit to then be able to charge in and deal some damage in melee as well. And having that extra defense is really going to help this unit do that. Going to help them be a little bit more versatile than something like the Reavers or the Imperial handgunny ones, whatever that's their name escapes me. Anyway, Darkborn Chariot, identical to the Conclave one, even down to the optional 5 point increase for bows, which those Deepwood scammers get for free. A nice option, nice because it's fairly cheap if you are wanting to really make the most of the exploit weakness ability from the Noble. You're going to want some cheap mobile units to maneuver around to try and help that Noble unit get that flank or rear charge. Chariots, nothing more to say, they're all pretty solid. But then we come to the tamed beasts and the Hydra, which really is not like anything else. Apologies if I've just been like comparing every unit to another unit, but I thought it'd be helpful to have a point of reference for how to compare the sort of power level for the other units. But the Hydra really is an interesting one. Because of the stat line, it looks somewhat weaker at 100 points than things like a Giant, which are the other kind of 100-point single model units in the game, and only 5 wounds, but it has regeneration on 5 wounds, which is kind of crazy because it means that you need to take it out in one turn. You need to do all 5 wounds against that defense 5 in one turn, otherwise there's no point. So I think what's going to happen is there are going to be games, or situations at least, where this is just unkillable. It gets into a situation against a unit that can't deal all 5 wounds in one go, and it's going to feel ridiculously overpowered and just like not die for the entire game and be like the best tar pit. On the flip side though, it's going to be in other situations where if a unit can just pop 5 wounds through, it's going to immediately die. So yeah, it's kind of situationally better or worse than your sort of traditional Giant sort of unit, but I still think it's going to fulfill a similar role with power 5 and 5 attacks. That's fairly average, maybe slightly weaker than a lot of things like Treants, Giants, stuff like that. But this is one that I'm going to have to play with to see how kind of strong this regeneration on 5 wounds is going to be. My temptation is to think it's going to be strong, and again, I think there's going to be situations where you just can't kill it and it's going to feel OP, but maybe at 100 points it's just going to kind of balance out to be just okay. We'll have to wait and see. And finally, let's take a look at the Harpies, which are statistically identical to the ones in Goatman. Did you know that goats can field Harpies? Possibly not, because at least in PvP they're never taken. However, I do think that is in a big part because they're competing in the one slot against Fell Giant and Minotaurs, which are 2 of the best units in that faction, maybe some of the best units in the game. So it's no surprise that you don't see them. I do think they're a bit overcosted. They compare pretty unfavorably when you pit them against 2 units of Hounds, which totals 100 points, same stat line, same number of wounds, but split across 2 units with a bonus and double the number of attacks. However, I do think that flying shouldn't be underestimated and is really strong, and I've always kind of wanted to make Harpies work, maybe even increase the model number a bit, and you can field them similar to how you see a mounted melee commander. You can just zip around, get into flanks, get into the rear, and really have a strong initial punch. But that's all the units. As I said at the beginning, it's a few kind of new things in amongst a lot of units that look quite similar to ones we've seen before, but taken from different factions in a new configuration is going to give a lot of new options for list building. Talking of which, let's take a look at some lists. All right, with this first list, really leaning into what I think is one of the strengths of the army, and that is their mounted units. I've gone with riders as the retinue for the noble here, but you could also swap them out for knights. As I mentioned, I do think both the riders and the raptor knights are slightly better than comparable units elsewhere, and I think this is going to play out quite similarly to the 3 cavalry conclave lists that you may have seen running around the PvP ladder. With the remaining points, I've gone with the Darkborn Shadows. After just saying they probably won't see much play, there's a lot of different things you could do with the remaining points here. I do think maybe this is a space for them where they can really play into that almost like skirmishy strategy with the shooting from the riders, sort of hit and run, using flee a lot. And I mentioned that this army in general, because of the high discipline, is going to be good at fleeing and you're going to want to use it a lot. This particular list is going to want to use it a lot. However, with the speed of the cavalry, you're going to want to be careful not to do it too close to the board edge and then just run off. But yeah, you could definitely drop these shadows. You can do a lot with the, well, not a lot because of the cost of units, but you could do some things like increase all of the mounted units, things like that. Moving on, this next one is going to be a re-implementation of a tried and tested strategy, because you may notice it looks quite similar to the Deepwood lists, or this Deepwood style of list. I talked about it a little bit in my last video, that runs a couple of units of archers and then just the treant to sit on objectives, and then the spears, just as in that list, are just here to fulfill the battle line requirement. Big difference here though is, yes, you don't get the Deepwood noble with the bow and the elven accuracy, but you get that hex of ruin, which for shooting just means that you have the opportunity to just pop off a really high defense, high value target. The other main difference here is Hydra instead of a treant, and I do think this is actually slightly worse. I mentioned that I think the Hydra is going to be situationally either really strong or not as good, and I think for lists like this, you would rather just have the durability, the consistency of the treant. But yeah, just as a lot of these elf lists, this unit is going to want to make use of the flee mechanic and do a lot of kind of hitting and running. This next one is built to really make the most of the exploit weakness mechanic or ability on the noble, because yeah, as I mentioned, you really want to pair it with lots of cheap mobile things. Unfortunately, because these are elves, there aren't actually that many cheap options, and it's quite hard to field a list with more than 5 units, which is definitely a weakness. But tried it here, got some riders, chariot, and yeah, I think maybe this is a good spot to try out those harpies. There is quite a lot of points put into the commander's retinue unit with an extra model. I've given unyielding just because I had 10 points left over. But you are relying on this unit to do a lot of the heavy lifting as well. So you're going to want your other units to be able to tie up your enemy or charge them, flee. So your retinue unit is able to get the charge at once, similar to how almost like other Death Star lists, like the big vampire, knight, and dread knights, is that what they're called? Dread knights units kind of play out, where it's all centered around like this one unit doing a lot of damage. And finally, I don't think this one's going to be all that good, but I really hope it is. Just building around the witches, which, yeah, with the 2-hand weapons, frenzy, poisoned attacks, and Hex of Ruin, just super punchy. But yeah, as I said, very glass cannon, and with only space for 2 other units, these are going to really want to be protecting the flanks, because these witch units really want to be fighting face on. I've also given the Priestess Shroud, which still don't seem much, but I think it could be really good in situations like this, where instead of having to pay for multiple Banner of Mists to protect, that does the same thing basically, that protects these units from shooting, you get to just take the 20-point spell instead. So yeah, very all-in glass cannon. Unfortunately, probably not going to be all that effective. But that'll do it. I think if a lot changes between now and when they're actually released, maybe sometime this coming week, I'm not sure, then I'll maybe put out another video. But if not too much changes, I'll just leave this one as it is. Let me know what you think of this army. As always, comment, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff for the YouTube algorithm. Until next time, bye-bye.